My neighbors called me trash for living small, now they're asking for help paying bills. When my neighbor Sandra yelled across the driveway, some of us actually work for a living, I just smiled and kept watering my little garden. She said it loud enough for everyone to hear, her voice dripping with smugness at that moment. I decided I wouldn't waste another second explaining myself to people who thought square footage defined success 3 years ago. I sold my big house after my divorce and bought a small one-bedroom cottage on the edge of the neighborhood. It wasn't fancy, old bricks, mismatched shutters, and a tiny patch of grass that I turned into a vegetable garden. To me, it felt peaceful. To them, it was trash. You see, my neighbors were the type who competed over lawn sizes, new cars, and holiday decorations. They had pool parties just to outshine each other, posting pictures online with captions like, simple blessings. When I moved in, they assumed I was broke. I drove an old truck, wore plain clothes, and didn't say much. One evening, I overheard Sandra and her husband Mark laughing, saying, she probably can't even afford Wi-Fi. Another time, when I waved hello, they ignored me, like I was invisible. The HOA president even hinted that my modest landscaping didn't fit the neighborhood's aesthetic. I wanted to tell them I wasn't struggling. I'd just chosen freedom after my divorce. I left the corporate grind, took my savings, and started freelancing online. No boss, no office, just peace and time for myself. But they wouldn't understand that. Then came the turning point last year. The economy took a dive, prices went up, jobs were cut, and suddenly, the people who used to host weekend parties were tightening their belts. I noticed fewer luxury deliveries, fewer gatherings. Sandra stopped talking about her investment portfolio. I still minded my own business, but karma has a funny way of turning things around. One afternoon, as I was loading groceries into my truck, Mark approached me. He was unusually friendly. Hey, do you happen to know anyone hiring? My company downsized, he said, pretending it was no big deal. I told him I'd keep an ear out, knowing full well his ego wouldn't survive a real job search. A week later, Sandra came over too. The same woman who once called me trashy for hanging laundry outside. She smiled awkwardly and said, you're good with budgeting, right? Mark and I are struggling with bills. Maybe you could help us figure things out. I almost laughed, but I kept a straight face. Of course, I said sweetly. Why don't you come over Saturday morning? She looked surprised, probably expecting me to refuse. On Saturday, they showed up, looking tired and humbled. My cottage smelled of coffee and freshly baked bread, and their eyes widened when they saw my setup. Clean, organized, cozy. Sandra glanced around and said, it's nice, really nice. I walked them through my system, how I grow half my food, how I save electricity, and how my freelance income pays more than their 9 to 5 ever did. Mark frowned when I mentioned I'd been debt-free for 2 years. Sandra looked embarrassed. So, you're not struggling? She asked carefully. I smiled. No, I just stopped trying to impress people who don't pay my bills. They nodded quietly for once. They had nothing clever to say. I helped them set up a budget, taught them about remote work options, and even gave them links to online resources as they left. Sandra said softly, thank you, Anne. I'm sorry about before. I didn't say anything, just smiled. Over the next few months, they changed. No more rude comments, no more side eyes. Sometimes they'd wave when I was in the garden. They even started planting a few vegetables of their own. But the best part came last week. The neighborhood HOA, which had once scolded me for having a non-conforming garden, held a community meeting. Guess who they invited to give a talk about sustainable living? Yep, me. Sandra introduced me like I was some local guru. This is our neighbor who taught us all how to live smarter, not harder, she said proudly. I stood there in the same clothes they once mocked, smiling politely while everyone clapped after the meeting. As people asked me questions about saving money and working remotely, I glanced at Sandra and Mark. They looked grateful, and maybe a little ashamed. Funny how life flips the script. When I got home, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, looking at the garden that had once made me the trash neighbor. The same soil that had fed me now symbolized something bigger, the power of living quietly, without needing anyone's approval. As I took a sip, I heard Sandra's voice again, but this time, she was calling out kindly, hey, we're trying your homemade compost recipe. Wish us luck. I grinned. They used to laugh at my small life. Now they're trying to live it.